You know, it's been far too long that the chassis for the Abomination Corvette has been left alone and ignored. And that's just sad. So how about this time around on the Horsepower Monster, we build the suspension that's going underneath this Corvette, and by the time we get done, we're gonna have a roller. Sounds like fun if I haven't bitten off more than I can chew. You'll hang around, won't you? That's heavy. Now, I don't know if you remember the video where we stripped the Corvette chassis down to the bare chassis, kind of did some repairs there and got it blasted and cleaned up. But I took apart the suspension in just chunks to get everything done. So now it's time to go ahead and get this back in order. As you can tell, I've already coated the upper control arms with POR 15 just to see how they would do. So it's time to blast this apart, clean it up, and see what can be salvaged and what needs to be replaced. I'm pretty sure the bushings are junk, but I'm wondering about the wheel bearings. I sure would like to be able to save some money here. Maybe I can reuse those. Amazingly, even though this is a 45-year-old car, the brake rotors are still the original units, which means the Corvette has probably spent much of its life exactly like I found it, off the road and just sitting outside in the weather. Anyhow, it's easy to tell the rotors are original because they came from the factory riveted to the spindles, which is totally unnecessary, and nobody ever rivets on replacement rotors. Getting them off isn't too technical, but it is a pain if you ask me. The best method I've found is to drill a hole about 3/8 of an inch deep with a 1/4 inch bit, and then switch to a larger 7/16 inch bit to knock the head off the rivet. There's 5 rivets on each rotor, so that's 1 between each lug, and a punch really helps because if you don't drill the hole pretty well centered on the rivet, the head will refuse to come out. But if that happens, and it did to me a couple times, I just put a carbide bit on a grinder and hog it out until it comes loose. And then, if the rotor is rusted in place like mine are, all that's required is a few hits with a dead blow mallet on the back side of the rotor to show it who's boss. Once the rotor is off, it does leave behind the rest of the big rivet that was holding the rotor onto the spindle. That has to go because replacement rotors don't even have the holes for the rivets anymore. So they have to be ground down enough that the rotor will sit flat against the face of the spindle. I just used a few 80 grit sanding discs, trying to be careful just to grind the rivets until they're flush and not grind into or warp up the face of the spindle. Then I was able to move on with the disassembly of the hubs and the spindles. Really, the spindles didn't need to come all the way apart, but I did want to get them cleaned up nice and also ditch the dust covers for the disc brakes, because hopefully I'll be adding a big disc brake kit later on, and who knows if they'll fit with those covers. And then it was cleanup time. I decided to start with the worst of it, the lower control arm. I got the worst of the gunk off of the lower control arms with the pressure washer, but I still need to wire brush them to get everything off before I POR 15 them. That's the plan there. But before I do that, I want to get them stripped down and get all the bushings out and everything. Now, some of these older control arms, you can use an air chisel to knock the bushings out, but I can't really figure out a good angle to do that with these Corvette style ones. So what I did was I picked up this little jewel from Amazon, and it's supposed to be a tool for removing bushings. Gonna see how it works. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hey, he just said he'd show us that tool to take the bushings out, and now he skipped right past it. And you're right. That's because it totally bombed. Totally bombed. And I'll get to why and what I did about it in just a minute. So, I got back to work cleaning up the lower control arms and then applied 2 coats of POR 15. Now, if you remember, I already applied POR 15 to the entire chassis, and it turned out well. So I'm using the remainder on the lower control arms. But it seems I still haven't learned my lesson. The directions very clearly said to apply 2 thin coats of the stuff, and I just tend to slather it on, which leads to plenty of runs and drip marks. But this ain't no show car, and the drips were easily fixed with a razor blade. Not fixed well, mind you, but fixed is fixed. The spindles and the rest of the suspension components I cleaned up as well, but I didn't want to have as much buildup as I typically get with the POR 15. So I shot them with black Rust-Oleum out of a rattle can. I already mentioned that the hub still spins pretty freely, so I was hopeful when I pulled them apart. The races definitely look good, and after getting the worst of the grease off with a few shots of brake cleaner, the wheel bearings didn't feel gritty or have any rough spots when I spun them in my hand. And I just decided to clean them up and try and reuse everything. So cleaning the bearings with brake cleaner is not exactly the best idea in the world, but I was out of lacquer thinner. Got some and picked some more up, and we'll do it right now. How do you open up? Now, I'm not exactly sure if it's a big deal, but I definitely want to keep the bearings with their races so they mate back together when I get everything clean to put back together. So I'm just going to do these one set at a time so I know which ones came out of which. I didn't want to bore you to death, so a lot of this was never on camera. But what you see here is the result of a couple of days spent with a wire wheel on the grinder, trying to clean up the rust off original parts and then painting everything. POR 15 on the control arms, and everything else is just kind of spray painted with Rust-Oleum. And then a ton of time chasing down parts, ball joint replacements, seals, shocks, and everything else. But now finally we get to the good part. It's time to put everything together. Where shall we start? One thing you may notice that I didn't show you was pulling the original bushings out of these lower control arms. That's because I tried and I failed. I actually even bought this installation removal bushing tool online, and I don't know if you can see it. It actually bent the cup trying to get it out. So I gave up and took it to a buddy's shop who's one of those old school dudes who's seen it all and he's done it all. And he said no problem, he could get it out. He said give him a day and come back. So I did. I gave him a day and I came back around again. And when I got back to his shop, he said, "Don't you ever bring this rusty junk to my shop again." So the Abomination Corvette strikes again. Anyhow, he got it out, and we're going to straighten out this cup and see if we can actually get the bushings installed now that everything is clean and straight. I was worried about any buildup from my too thick application of POR 15 keeping the bushings from fitting properly. So I knocked off the excess with a barrel sander attachment on my Milwaukee grinder. This thing is pretty sweet. So this is new. I did the first control arm without the camera on just as a test so I could figure out what I was doing. And it worked perfect. That never happens. So it actually just practically fell right together. So we'll do this one this time and show you what I did and how it works. This tool, it took me a minute to figure out how it was going on because it has 0 instructions. All it's got is a parts list, which is worthless, but I got it for like 60 bucks. And it probably would have worked fine for pulling the bushings out if they hadn't been so seized in there, but they work pretty good for putting them in. I'll put a link in the description below for this if you're interested. Not the greatest, but it's certainly not terrible either. So anyhow, to start with, we don't have to have the control arm mount in place. We'll just go ahead and slot the first one in there like that. Go ahead and push it on in. And then what we have is this big C-clip clamp, and we use this ring Fits right over like that. And then to hold the ring, you got to have this cup, but then there's a big old hole in it, so you have to run this cup over that. So once you get all three in place, now I found it's kind of easier to go ahead and just let it hang. Set it on here, let it hang, and then you can get it where you want it. The upper control arms were a piece of cake. The bushings are just pressed through one piece of metal, but the lowers are a totally different story. As you can see, the lower control arm has a flange on both sides, so the bushing has to be pressed through two holes in two pieces of metal. The problem would come from the fact that the flanges on the lower control arms would flex as you try to push the bushing in. And you can see that happening here. And then because of the flexing, when the two holes are no longer parallel, the bushing would bind up and refuse to move. The solution, it turns out, is pretty simple. I wish I could take credit for it, but I found it on the internet. I just pressed a socket that's the right depth in there. Really, anything the right thickness will do. And that acted as a spacer to eliminate the flex, and the bushing practically fell into place. And then it was simply a matter of installing the new ball joints. These are OEM style replacements from Moog. Nothing special here, but I'll include a link where I found them for the best price. Now, prices for car parts are really volatile right now. By the time you see this, the prices may have changed quite a bit, so don't blame me if it's more. But I think I only paid something like $22 each for the upper ball joints and $32 for the lowers. I started to put new bolts into the spindles when putting them together, but the original nuts from GM have an interference thread, so they can't back off. So I decided to keep them and just clean them up with a wire wheel and reused everything. Reassembling the hubs was nothing too special. I don't own a bearing packing tool, so I just packed the grease in by hand. In my younger days, I worked for Circle Track and stock car racing magazines, and I've been around a lot of old timers that could pack wheel bearings by hand faster than you can blink and without making any mess. I still don't know how they do that. I've never been able to learn that skill, but even if it's ugly, as long as I can get the bearings completely packed with grease, I'll call that a win.
Three days later.
So it has been a minute. I spent a little bit of time putting together the suspension on the passenger side before I turned on the camera to do this one over here, and it did not go as expected. The problem that I ran into is that the spring pocket on the Corvette, and it's hard to see here, is in the chassis right here, and it's on a strong angle. Let me say, if you see the spring sit like that, see that angle it sits on? Now normally what you do is you already have your lower control arm bolted up in place. You put a spring compressor in there, compress it down, chuck it up in there, and then tie in everything together by bolting the spindle to the upper and lower control arm like this. But when I would do it, the lower control arm, sorry about that, mounts right here, and it would sit so low, and the spring angle will be way down here. I couldn't get them both to sit in this pocket right here and in here without popping out and getting all bound up and everything. So the solution that I came up with, and I'm definitely not saying this is the way to go, but it worked for me, was I got two long pieces of threaded rod and dropped down the lower pivot point to the control arm down here so I could keep things level, and then slowly brought everything up together. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here in just a second. But first, I've realized the mistake I've made. I need to go back and fix. We're gonna have to fire up the welder. Alrighty, this is the issue that I spotted, and actually I saw it earlier, I just forgot about it. But spring sits here, the shock goes right through here, and the bottom of the shock mounts here and here. As you can see, there's a welded in nut here, and when I was doing disassembly, this one popped off, and it goes right there. The problem is, at first I was like, well, I'll just throw a nut in there and I'll tighten it up when I get to it. But as you can see, once the coil spring is in place, it's impossible to reach. So what I've got to do is weld that nut back in place. Easy, right? Except I jumped the gun, went ahead and did POR 15 everywhere. Now I've got to grind it back off before I can get a good weld. To ensure I got a good ground, and also to hold the nut that's going to be welded in position, I threaded in a bolt. About 5 washers hold the head of the bolt away from the control arm enough that I can get the ground clamp attached solid and it won't slip off. As with all of my welding, it's ugly, but it's stuck. And a fresh coat of paint will help hide my lack of aesthetics, as the cool people say. Another issue I've run into is this design for the coil spring compressor. You set it up so the hooks on this compressor grab the coil spring, and then you thread it in and run it up like this. But the more you compress the spring, the more this section of threaded rod sticks out up the top here. And then once you put it in position, it hits this piece of steel that's the mount for the upper control arm and the top of the shock. Every time. The solution to this particular problem turned out to have an easy answer. And again, I found it on the internet. YouTube this time, in fact. Anyhow, I purchased a piece of cheap black iron pipe from the big hardware store. It's the stuff that plumbers use, which I think was a 3/16 inch ID to fit over the threaded portion of the spring compressor, and then cut it down to 4 inches in length. Then it slots underneath the lower set of hooks to keep the slack at the bottom of the compressor instead of the top. That allowed me to get to work with my clumsy solution to install the coil spring. Now this worked for me, but I'm sure there are guys out there who have come up with a better way to get the job done in the same situation. If you're one of those guys that have a better idea, I'd love to hear it in the comments. When tightening the spindle nut to secure the hub, I generally just slowly tighten it down until the hub will no longer slide in and out on the spindle, and then I can start to feel a little bit of drag as I spin it. Then I back off the nut just enough to get the cotter pin through. One of the last things to do up front before we're done, at least that I've got parts for, is the shocks. And I've got some pretty nice KYB gas adjust shocks for the front and for the rear. And so these are more modern monotube shocks than I think the originals were twin tube. These should be a whole lot better, but it's important to note what I ran into when I was getting these, because I was looking on a car parts store. Let's just say they are in the zone with what they got going on, and I had a 10% off coupon, and they were going to run $67.19 each for the fronts and $67.99 each for the rears. Started price shopping, and I actually went on Amazon and found them for $33.82 for the front and $39.95 for the rears. Now normally I don't get into prices because they change constantly, but that was such a big difference. I thought it was worth letting you know. So I've written it down. It was going to be $270.36 for all four plus shipping, but I got them on Amazon for $147.54, and because I'm a Prime member, shipping was free. So that's a savings of $122. If you're interested in that, I will put a link to these on Amazon in the description below. Anyhow, let's go ahead and get these on. The rotors are stock replacements from AC Delco I found off Amazon. They didn't really need to go on right now, but I just wanted to see how cool they all look. Last up on the front of the car, let's do something about this nasty sway bar. As you can see, I've already cleaned up the front sway bar, just a little bit of time with the wire brush on a grinder and some paint, and it's good to go. But unfortunately, the soft products for it were junk. The bushings that were original had totally rotted out, so they're gone. New urethane bushings from Energy Suspension, and here are the end links. This stuff is just rotten and nasty. And so it was only about 20 something bucks and a new set of end links from Energy Suspension. So we'll be putting those on too. Now, one of the big complaints with poly bushings is that they squeak compared to the OEM rubber stuff. So one of the things that Energy Suspension has done is they've got these graphite impregnated bushings. They're supposed to help with that. But honestly, if we can hear the squeaking over the engine noise with this build, I think I'm doing something wrong. And that pretty much completes the front suspension. Time to move to the back. Now this is a big chunk of rear end. Unlike the front suspension, I'm not planning on totally blowing this apart, cleaning it up and putting it back together. Two main reasons for that. One, the engine that I built for the Corvette is worth about 600 horsepower, and probably this will not survive very long anyway, so it's going to get upgraded. And two, the rear leaf spring is bound up right now. It's under tension, and the best way to get it loose is while the rear end is still in the car. Obviously, I didn't do that, so I don't have a good way of getting the rear leaf spring off without killing myself. So what I'm going to try to do is clean it up as good as I can. Some of the bushings need to be replaced. I want to check the ring and pinion gear, make sure it's good, put some fresh lube in there, check out the bearings and everything, and if everything looks good, just kind of paint it up, give it a rattle can rebuild, and slap it back in there. So first step, tear down, which is actually a problem in itself because the number of times I've worked on an independent rear suspension, 0. This rear section has collected many years and many miles worth of grease and grime. So the first step is a once over with my trusty pressure washer. And then there was some time spent with a few different sizes of wire wheels on a few different sizes of grinders, but you really didn't want to see all that, did you? And finally, a coat of paint to put lipstick on this pig and hide all the real problems. So it may look better, but it's just a rattle can rebuild. The guts are all still the same. Now the plan, if I mentioned it already, is to wait until I get it back under the Corvette, get some stuff on the chassis to give it some weight, and then I can use a jack to compress that big old leaf spring in the back, get these trailing arms off, and get the spindles and everything rebuilt in there. But there is one area before I get started putting this back under the chassis that's got to be taken care of right now. These bushings are so rotten, there's practically nothing left. So let's replace them now. But these bushings are made with the inner steel sleeve swedged outward on the ends to capture the larger bushing on the edges. To get it off, the whole assembly has to be cut out. Replacing these bushings was definitely a good plan. Once I got them apart, it's easy to see the rubber was totally rotten. The replacement bushings I purchased are a set of modern poly bushings from Prothane. But the main reason I chose them is that they don't require me to purchase any special tools to swedge the inner sleeve like the stock bushings. They do, however, reuse the outer shell, so those need to be saved. I left the outer shells right where they were, but after all these years and with the deterioration of the rubber bushings, they are totally fouled with built up rubber, dirt, and who knows what else. The stuff just wouldn't wipe out. So I used a sanding drum on the grinder once again to clean it all up. Just had to be careful not to eat into the metal of the shells at all if I could help it. Thankfully, they cleaned up pretty well, so I greased everything up with the included lubricant and installed the bushings. The outer washers I thought might slide over the sleeves, but they don't. They'll have to be installed once the trailing arm is in the car. Getting the entire rear assembly back into the car in a single chunk definitely was a pain. And as you can see, I had to break out a ratchet strap for a little persuasion. If you have the trailing arms in place, it seems the upper mounts to the chassis didn't want to go in position. And if you had the big aluminum arms in their mounts on the chassis, well then the trailing arms didn't want to go into place. It was all a big puzzle and I fought it for way too long. But I finally got both trailing arms and one chassis mount bolted up, and for some reason the chassis was too wide to fit the other side of the rear end into its bracket. So I had to break out the ratchet strap yet again to pull the chassis together enough to get the bolt in. I don't remember it being bound up or anything when I pulled the car apart, but it must have been. So before I forget about it, it's time to get these shims installed in the rear end. Now these shims are a bunch of different thicknesses. As you can see, we got a really thin one here, and they get pretty fat too. The shims slot in, are supposed to be on either side of these rear trailing arms, and more on the outside increases tow, more on the inside pulls it out. And from what I've seen on the internet, you're supposed to be centered up, but this Corvette, like always, is kind of throwing me a loop. When I pulled it apart, all the shims were on the outside, maximizing the tow to the end on both sides of the Corvette, and I can't really get it pulled out too much. So I'm just going to put it back in there like it was, and then depend on a good alignment shop to help me out and make sure everything is correct once I get this car back on the road. The shims are slotted, so you can just pop them in there. And then there's a hole in the opposite end. That's for this giant cotter pin, so they can't fly out of place no matter how rough the road. And then with the rear end fully bolted up, I can install the monotube KYB shocks in the rear. And yes, I went back with the ratchet strap one more time to help compress the suspension enough to get the shock bolted up. I'm beginning to think the old ratchet strap trick is starting to become a crutch for me. One thing I've learned you've got to be careful about with the C3 Corvette is dimensionally the front and rear disc brakes are the same, at least on the outside, but on the inside here they're different because the rears capture the drum brakes for the parking brake. It's easy to tell the difference though because the rear discs have extra holes in the hat so that you can adjust the drum brakes with the discs on. Oh, so nice. I'm getting excited about this again. It's always nice when you can start bolting on shiny new parts instead of ripping off old rusty junk. Anyhow, I know I said that the goal for this video was to get the car on the tires and rolling again. And we can do that now, except I've got one more thing I want to do. I have been dying to get my new fuel tank installed. So let's do that quick too. The fuel tank will definitely have to come back out again sometime before this build is complete. But if it's in the car, then it's no longer in the floor of my shop getting in the way. The retaining straps wouldn't get tight enough to properly secure the tank. That's probably because I didn't put down any insulating rubber between the straps and the tank, and also between the lower mounting bar and the tank. So cutting some rubber strips and putting them in there will probably help. And then that's it. Time to actually make this roller, well, a roller. Well, that was fun. And if you say you're gonna make a roller, you gotta actually put tires and wheels on it and make a roller, right? Of course, the next steps means we're obviously gonna have to put it back on jack stands, pull the wheels and tires back off, but hey, it was fun while it lasted. And this feels like progress. If you've been following along with the progress of the Abomination Corvette build this far, I am sorry that this video took so long to get out. Hoping to have a lot more fun, a lot more regular updates with it very soon. And to that end, I've already gone ahead and ordered parts for the next video. I think the plan will be to rebuild these nasty, grungy, seized up brake calipers, all four, all the way around. That should be more interesting than just going out and buying new and bolting them up. So we're gonna see how that goes. And while I'm at it, I'll probably also start bending up some brake lines, get everything plumbed up and see how that looks. Anyhow, make sure to stick around and we'll come back soon with more fun. And before you know it, this thing's gonna be burning gas. Thanks again.